In 1260, a force thought unstoppable, the Mongol horde, swept across continents, leaving cities in ash and armies shattered. Entire kingdoms trembled before them, but in a quiet valley in Palestine, a small, determined army did the unthinkable. They faced the legendary Mongols, and for the first time, broke their myth of invincibility. How did a handful of soldiers stand against the greatest empire the world had ever seen? The answer changes everything we thought we knew about history. In this video, you'll witness the shocking tactics, hidden strategies, and unexpected heroes of Ain Jalut, a battle that proved even the mightiest empire could be challenged. By the middle of the 13th century, an empire had risen so fast and struck so hard that many believed history itself had surrendered. Wherever Mongol horses appeared, cities vanished, rulers bowed, and resistance seemed not only futile, but suicidal. From the windswept steppes of Central Asia, the Mongols expanded with terrifying speed, beginning under Genghis Khan in the early 1200s and continuing under his sons and grandsons, until their banners stretched from China to Eastern Europe. Cities like Samarkand, Kiev, and Nishapur were shattered, while entire populations were erased to send a message that traveled farther than any army. Their strength lay not only in numbers, but in mobility, discipline, and psychological warfare. Retreats that were traps, messengers who carried ultimatums instead of negotiations, and executions designed to crush hope before battle even began. By 1258, when Hulagu Khan sacked Baghdad and ended the Abbasid Caliphate, the spiritual and intellectual heart of the Islamic world collapsed, and with it, the belief that anything sacred could survive the Mongol advance. No major army had defeated the Mongols in open combat, and by 1260, their forces were pressing toward Egypt, the last great power standing in their path. While rulers across the region faced a brutal choice: submit and survive, or resist and be erased from history. But beyond the deserts of Syria, a different kind of army was preparing to stand its ground, knowing there was nowhere left to retreat, and that belief itself was about to be tested. In 1258, one of the greatest cities on earth fell in less than 2 weeks. Its libraries burned, its rivers darkened with ink and blood. After Baghdad fell, the world did not ask if the Mongols would come next, but when. The sack of Baghdad by Hulagu Khan sent shockwaves across continents, because this was not just another city destroyed, but the symbolic heart of Islamic civilization, a center of learning, faith, and power that had stood for 5 centuries before collapsing almost overnight. With the Abbasid Caliph executed and the city left silent, long-standing political balances shattered, and rulers from Anatolia to North Africa understood that no title, no wall, and no tradition offered protection anymore. Trade routes trembled, courts emptied, and messengers carried the same whispered fear that the Mongol tide was still moving west and south. In Damascus, Aleppo, and Cairo, leaders studied maps with growing dread, knowing the Mongols had already conquered Persia, Russia, and much of Eastern Europe, while their armies adapted faster than anyone could respond, learning enemy tactics almost as quickly as they destroyed them. By 1260, the question narrowed to Egypt, ruled by the Mamluks, whose armies were hardened by discipline but haunted by history, because no force had ever stopped the Mongols head-on, and submission had saved some cities, while resistance had erased others without mercy. Yet in Cairo, decisions were being made in silence, as leaders weighed fear against survival, unaware that the next choice would pull 2 unstoppable forces onto a single, narrow battlefield. By 1260, 2 armies were moving toward each other, shaped by opposite histories and opposite beliefs, yet bound by the same understanding that the coming battle would not decide land alone, but determine whose way of war would survive. On one side stood the Mongols, commanded in Syria by Kitbuk-Noyan, a veteran general forged in the campaigns of Hulagu Khan, leading forces built for speed, shock, and relentless pressure, where mounted archers could strike, vanish, and return before an enemy line could even form. Their power rested not only in tactics, but in fear, because most cities surrendered long before battle began, knowing what followed resistance. Facing them were the Mamluks of Egypt, an army unlike any other, made up of former slave soldiers, trained from youth in horsemanship, discipline, and absolute loyalty to the state, ruled in 1260 by Sultan Qutuz, with the brilliant commander Baybars rising at his side. These men had survived brutal training, internal coups, and constant threats, forging a culture where order, endurance, and control mattered more than terror. As the Mongol forces advanced into Syria, the Mamluks chose not to wait behind walls, but to march north, crossing the Sinai and entering enemy territory, a decision that signaled something rare, a willingness to meet the Mongols in open battle on chosen ground. Both sides understood the risk, because once armies collided without retreat, speed and fear would no longer decide everything, and the land itself would soon take a role in shaping history. Before a single sword was raised or an arrow released, the Mongols had already won countless battles in the minds of their enemies, because fear, carefully cultivated and brutally proven, often collapsed resistance long before armies ever met. As the year 1260 unfolded, memories of Mongol destruction followed every commander like a shadow, shaping decisions in tents, councils, and silent moments before dawn, where leaders weighed maps against nightmares of cities erased for defiance. Stories of Baghdad, Aleppo, and countless unnamed towns circulated through the Mamluk ranks, not as distant history, but as warnings written in ash, reminding them that retreat had saved lives before, while resistance had often invited annihilation. Sultan Qutuz understood this pressure deeply, knowing his authority depended on confidence, yet his army was made of men who had seen betrayal, punishment, and sudden death long before facing the Mongols. Even among the Mongol commanders, fear moved quietly because they were far from their homeland, separated from Hulagu Khan, and operating with limited forces in unfamiliar terrain. In this fragile balance, the critical decision was not how to fight, but whether to fight at all, as Qutuz rejected submission and ordered his army forward, while Kitbuka, bound by duty and belief in Mongol supremacy, chose engagement over caution, setting two convictions on an irreversible path. With fear now locked into both sides, attention shifted away from numbers and reputation toward the land itself, because where the battle would be fought might decide everything that followed. History often remembers generals and armies, yet in 1260, an unassuming stretch of land would quietly decide the fate of empires, because at Ain Jalut, geography itself was about to step onto the battlefield. Ain Jalut, meaning the spring of Goliath, lay in a narrow valley of northern Palestine, bordered by low hills, scattered trees, and uneven ground that restricted wide cavalry movements, a sharp contrast to the open plains where Mongol horse archers thrived. For the Mamluks, led by Sultan Qutuz and guided by the tactical mind of Baybars, this landscape offered something rare, a chance to limit speed, visibility, and maneuver, turning space into control rather than exposure. The Mongols, under Kitbuka, advanced with confidence shaped by decades of success, accustomed to drawing enemies into pursuit across open terrain, where arrows and mobility crushed resistance. As both armies approached Ain Jalut in late summer of 1260, neither fully grasped how deeply the land would shape the coming hours, because terrain, once chosen, does not forgive miscalculation. By committing to Ain Jalut, the Mamluks made a deliberate gamble, accepting the risk of open battle while quietly stripping the Mongols of their greatest advantage, transforming hills into shields and narrow paths into barriers that slowed momentum and forced engagement on unfamiliar terms. As dawn approached and formations settled into place, the valley fell silent, unaware that the first movements would not reveal strength, but disguise intention in a way the Mongols had rarely faced. When the first movements unfolded at Ain Jalut, they looked familiar, almost predictable, as if history itself were repeating a pattern the Mongols had mastered, one that had lured countless enemies into destruction before. As the battle opened in September 1260, Mongol cavalry pressed forward with controlled aggression, testing the Mamluk lines with arrows and rapid movement, confident that pressure would trigger panic or reckless pursuit, just as it had so many times before. Under Kitbuka's command, the Mongols relied on a strategy refined across continents, striking hard and then pulling back, inviting the enemy to chase what appeared to be retreat. When the Mamluk front began to fall away, step by measured step, it seemed to confirm Mongol expectations, reinforcing the belief that fear was once again doing the work of victory. Yet beneath the surface, discipline held firm, because Baybars, commanding the Mamluk vanguard, controlled every withdrawal, turning motion into misdirection rather than collapse. As the Mongols advanced deeper into the valley, momentum shifted quietly, because what looked like a fleeing enemy was drawing them away from open ground, compressing their formations and narrowing their options, while hidden Mamluk forces waited beyond sight, unmoving and patient. With confidence now rising on one side and silence on the other, the valley tightened around the advancing Mongols, unaware that the next signal would transform retreat into revelation and momentum into shock. For decades, no battlefield had ever witnessed Mongol momentum truly collapse. Yet at Ain Jalut, in a matter of moments, certainty dissolved into confusion, and a force built on control found itself reacting instead of commanding. As Mongol cavalry pressed deeper into the valley, their formations stretched and tightened at the same time, compressed by hills and trees that limited movement, while dust and noise blurred signals that once traveled cleanly across open plains. Then, at Baybar's signal, hidden Mamluk units surged from behind the ridges, striking the Mongol flanks with sudden force, turning what had felt like pursuit into encirclement. Sultan Qutuz committed his reserves, pushing forward at the precise moment Mongol cohesion began to fray, as arrows lost rhythm and command lines strained under unexpected pressure. For the first time, Mongol tactics built on speed and fear faced resistance that neither scattered nor panicked, but closed in with discipline and intent, forcing Kitbuka's forces into a fight they had not planned to finish here. As the clash intensified, Mongol lines broke apart in pockets, retreat paths vanished, and control slipped from seasoned commanders, culminating in the capture and execution of Kitbuka himself, a moment that shattered morale and confirmed, in real time, that the Mongols could be defeated. When the dust finally settled, survivors fled with a truth that would echo far beyond the valley, because Ain Jalut had not only ended a battle, it had wounded a legend the world feared. The most powerful empires rarely fall first on the battlefield. They fracture in the mind, and after Ain Jalut, the Mongols carried away something far more dangerous than losses, the knowledge that they could be stopped. As the surviving Mongol forces withdrew from the valley in 1260, the defeat at Ain Jalut spread faster than any army, because for the first time, the story told by survivors did not end in triumph, but in shock and disbelief. Soldiers who had grown up believing Mongol victory was inevitable now spoke of ambush, resistance, and commanders overwhelmed by chaos rather than control. Across Syria and beyond, the psychological balance shifted, as cities that once surrendered at the mere rumor of Mongol approach began to question that instinct. Even within Mongol ranks, the loss of Kitbuka carried symbolic weight, signaling that loyalty and courage were no longer guarantees of victory. Fear, once their greatest weapon, began to weaken as its source was exposed. For the Mamluks, the victory was more than survival. It was proof, carried by messengers and memory, that discipline and strategy could break even the most feared force on earth, transforming Ain Jalut into a turning point that reshaped confidence across the region. Yet battles rarely end when the fighting stops, and as the world absorbed the shock, the consequences of Ain Jalut began to ripple outward, altering borders, ambitions, and the future of empires. When the dust settled at Ain Jalut, the silence carried farther than the clash itself, because the world was left to process an outcome that few believed possible. The Mongol advance had stopped, and history had taken a sudden breath. In the months following September 1260, the consequences of the battle unfolded steadily across the region, as Mongol forces withdrew from much of Syria and the immediate threat to Egypt faded, granting the Mamluk Sultanate a survival that had once seemed improbable. Cairo emerged not merely intact, but strengthened, as Sultan Qutuz and later Baybars consolidated authority and secured the eastern Mediterranean against further Mongol expansion. For the wider Islamic world, Ain Jalut restored a sense of continuity after the trauma of Baghdad's fall, proving that collapse was not inevitable and that resistance could succeed under the right conditions. Trade routes stabilized, alliances shifted, and political calculations began to change, as rulers no longer viewed Mongol dominance as absolute or eternal. Strategically, Ain Jalut marked the western limit of Mongol expansion, forcing the Ilkhanate to reassess its ambitions while signaling to Europe and the Middle East alike that Mongol power had limits shaped by geography, logistics, and determined opposition. Yet the true legacy of Ain Jalut would extend beyond borders and timelines, because its meaning would continue to echo wherever empires believed themselves unstoppable. And history prepared its final lesson. History often turns not at the moment of victory, but at the instant belief collapses, and at Ain Jalut in 1260, the world learned that even the most feared empire could be stopped. Once the illusion of destiny was broken, for centuries, the Mongols were remembered as a force that reshaped continents through speed, coordination, and psychological dominance. Yet Ain Jalut exposed the fragile foundation beneath that reputation, because power built on inevitability cannot survive when inevitability is questioned. The Mamluk victory did not erase Mongol strength, but it redefined it, introducing limits where none had been imagined before, and reminding future rulers that discipline, terrain, and leadership could challenge even overwhelming force. In the years that followed, generals studied Ain Jalut not as a miracle, but as a lesson where preparation overcame fear and strategy reshaped fate. The battle entered memory not as an accident of history, but as proof that outcomes are shaped by decisions made under pressure, long before swords ever cross. Ain Jalut stands as a moment when belief shifted, because once armies knew the Mongols could be defeated, submission was no longer the only option, and resistance, carefully planned and executed, became a rational choice rather than a desperate gamble. And so, the echo of that day still lingers, reminding every rising power that invincibility is never permanent, and that history waits patiently for the moment belief begins to crack. 8 centuries ago, on a quiet plain called Ain Jalut, the world learned a hard truth. Power is not eternal. An empire built on fear met preparation, patience, and resolve, and history shifted in a single afternoon. If this story moved you, support PASTORA by liking the video, sharing it with someone who loves history, and subscribing for more calm, cinematic documentaries. Next, we explore another moment when belief collapsed, and the world changed forever.